Today's story begins in 1965 in Wolverhampton, England. Drummer Don Powell, guitarist Dave Hill, bass player Jim Lee and frontman Noddy Holder formed a band called the In-Betweens who played R&B and Motown. From their formation in 1965 through till 1969, they were writing, recording and releasing records and patiently building up a live reputation. None of their releases had any impact, but a breakthrough was on the horizon. In 1969, they were offered a record deal with Fontana Records on the condition that they changed their name and got a manager in London. So the band changed their name to Ambrose Slade, and their debut album, Beginnings, came out in 1969, but flopped. But though they hadn't yet had a breakthrough into the mainstream, there was exciting stuff happening behind the scenes. Because while they had been recording their first album, former Animals bass player and Jimi Hendrix manager Chas Chandler had heard them while they worked in the studio. According to the book Whatever Happened to Slade, by 1968 Chandler had become frustrated with the protracted recording sessions for Electric Ladyland and had left the Hendrix operation. He was now at large on the London scene looking for a new challenge. He was tipped off about Slade and came down to Stanhope Place where they were finishing their first album, and Chandler was thoroughly impressed. Chandler liked what he saw, but he needed to see Ambrose Slade live, so a live date was arranged. Singer and frontman Noddy Holder recalled, "There were only 20 people in the place, but we were doing audience participation, where everybody else was doing long solos and very introverted music. Chandler loved us and signed us the next day." Our first new publicity pictures came out in the NME. They were full-length shots of the four of us, standing separately in different poses. And for the first time we were billed as Slade, not Ambrose Slade, which suited us fine. Chandler moved the band to Polydor Records and produced their next album himself, Play It Loud, which came out in 1970, but once again it also failed to make any impact whatsoever, and flopped. But Slade had, as this story will go on to show, almost superhuman levels of perseverance. It was after approximately 5 years of back-to-back failed releases that their breakthrough finally came. For years they'd been playing a cover song called Get Down and Get With It at their live shows where it went down a storm. At Chandler's suggestion, Slade released their version as a single in 1971 and at last broke through into the top 20 for the first time. Get Down and Get With It reached number 16 in the UK singles charts, and that moment marked the start of Slade's rapid ascent to the top of the world of rock and roll. At this time in the UK, the glam rock movement was emerging, so the band, who had started out by experimenting with a band image as skinheads that hadn't really worked, now grew their hair long and instead aligned themselves with the glam movement. And to capitalise on their first successful single, they needed to make a follow-up record, and fast. The next single was a new original, written by bassist Lee and frontman Noddy Holder, called 'Cause I Love You, which, apparently, they wrote in just half an hour. Drummer Don Powell says, "When we recorded it, we weren't sure. I remember Chas saying, 'You've got your first number one here,' but we couldn't see it because it wasn't what we used to play. We actually never even played it on stage, but Chas said, 'I don't care what you think, it's coming out.' He then took the master to Polydor and they freaked." And when the single came out, Chas Chandler turned out to have been right on the money. At last, Slade had their first UK number one. And so began 2 years in the sun for the band, a pretty much unbroken run of success. After all those failures, after all those flops, just look at what their music did over the next 2 years. The next single was Look What You Done, which hit number 4. The next album, Slade Alive, hit number 2 in the UK, number 1 in Australia, and gave them their first chart entry in the States. The next single, Take Me Back Home, hit number 1 in the UK, and so did the next one, Mama We're All Crazy Now. Slade were on a roll and gathering pace. At the end of 1972, their next album, which was called Slade but spelled differently, hit number 1 in the UK and Australia, and they also slowly began charting higher in America. The final single of that year was Goodbye to Jane, which peaked at number 2. And so 1972 had been pretty much wall-to-wall unbroken success for the band. and 1973 would go on to be pretty much the same. They released 4 singles that year, 3 of which went to number 1 and 1 of which went to number 2, and among these were 2 of their most famous songs, Come On Feel the Noise and Merry Christmas Everybody. But it was in the next year, 1974, that things started to go wrong for Slade, and their run at the very top of the UK music scene began to falter. The album Stomp Your Hands, Clap Your Feet flopped in America, creating an ever-building frustration amongst the band at their lack of success stateside. The band made a film to be released the following year called Slade in Flame. They released the soundtrack at the end of '74, where it hit number 6. It appeared that Slade had now had their rise and were now on the other side, declining in popularity. The single from the soundtrack, How Does It Feel, hit number 15, and the follow-up hit number 7. And so, after actually around 3 years in the glorious sunshine of success and popularity, things had now started to go wrong for Slade.
There is a downside to movies which starts to show groups in other ways which the public don't like to see. And I think I always noted that our decline started after that movie.
But the rocks that really sunk the ship were actually one of the most often repeated challenges to any great British band, breaking America. While Slade were still doing well in the UK and around the world in other countries, the most lucrative market was, as always, America. And they were becoming increasingly frustrated at their inability to break through. In Europe, culture had begun to move on, and they were aware that they were getting an increasingly tepid response. And so the band made the ill-fated decision to relocate to the USA to attempt to finally get a foothold there. They were there from mid-1975 through to the beginning of 1977, but sadly, the entire thing was a failure. They released an album called Nobody's Fools that was aimed directly at the US market. When it came out, it did okay in the UK, but that downward trend was still continuing. And it made no impact at all in the USA, the country it was intended for. The final single from the album was the first one by the band ever to fail to chart since their first rise to fame.
Every time they tried to do anything in America, something would happen where it would prevent them. I mean, they should have been the biggest thing since the Beatles in America.
And so, having had enough, Slade returned to the UK in 1977. But they came back only to discover that culture had moved on even further in their absence, and that they, and glam rock, were now out of fashion and becoming passé. Guitarist Dave Hill says, looking at the chart in August '76, it was very different. Disco was starting to get a hold on things, while on the live scene, something called punk rock was getting kids excited. They were very uncertain times for us. Slade attempted to get re-established in the UK with a new single, Gypsy Roadhog, but despite a TV performance, this also failed to enter the top 40. Having had a meteoric rise, Slade were now just as rapidly on the way down. They brought out an album that year that seemed to sum it all up. It was called Whatever Happened to Slade, and of course, it too failed to chart. We were seen as old hat. The tickets didn't sell for the UK tour the way they had before, and the album didn't chart at all. It was America all over again, only this time at home. For a while, we were just thrashing around, not knowing what to do. We tried all sorts of things. I shaved all my hair off, I got a leather jacket and Doc Martens, and tried to give us a harder image to blend in with the times, but that didn't do anything. The band pressed on, but in the aftermath of their failed America trip and ever-decreasing chart success, they found themselves only able to play live in smaller venues, like universities and clubs.
Because the whole scene over here had changed, as far as we're concerned anyway. I mean, the punk thing had taken over, if you like, and we were out of favour. We couldn't do like a concert tour because we didn't have any success to be able to sell out those kind of places. So we went back to playing small clubs.
In 1978 and 1979, Slade released 7 singles, and not one of them charted in any country at all. Noddy says, after 2 years of being back on the club and ballroom circuit, we began to feel like we were on a hiding to nothing. We still weren't getting any radio play, we weren't making much money, we weren't selling many records, and we had never earned a lot from touring. By the end of 1979, none of us could see any light at the end of the tunnel. Most of our records got nowhere near the top 20, and we had no idea how to get out of our situation either. What might have been the final straw occurred in May 1980 when the band released their first EP, Six of the Best. It flopped, of course, and at this point the band had to start taking part-time jobs to support themselves.
Our record company had dropped us then, and we were on a small record label called Barn, which Chas Chandler ran, you see. But really no big label wanted us because they said they paid the dues, that, nobody comes back, nobody's going to make it, They've had too many hits anyway, so they saw us as the end of the line as far as the hits were concerned.
Dave says, "We worked really hard, we played anywhere that would have us, clubs, universities, colleges, Mecca bingo halls, but there didn't seem to be any glimmer of hope back home. They were really hard times, but we did it to keep the band together in the belief that something would turn up."
Talk about losing egos, that's the one place you start to lose them, when you start hitting the dumps, We used to call them the chicken in the basket places, where people used to come in, have chicken in the basket, and you'd probably get a fat businessman out with his secretary, then you'd get a few trendies coming in, dancing on the old disco floor, going, "Who's this lot? Oh, it's that bunch from the 70s, and they'd probably come in to laugh at you, actually, thinking that you'd be a parody, a bit of a joke.
Slade had gone all the way to the top, and then all the way back to where they started again. And, perhaps understandably, at this point they were right on the edge of calling it quits. Slade were now on the verge of breaking up, and for guitarist Dave Hill, that had more or less basically happened. He says, "You can hold on to a dream only for so long before reality overwhelms you. And I reached that point in 1980. I started to wonder if I should get out and do something else. I was pretty disillusioned.
We couldn't see any light at the end of the tunnel. The radio weren't playing any of our records. We were getting no TV, we were getting no press coverage. We were just banging our heads against a brick wall, except on the live side of things. And I suppose we did come to a breaking point, just because we just didn't think we were going to crack it."
Slade had already started to tip over the cliff edge into oblivion when a fellow Midlander, Ozzy Osbourne, made a decision that would set off an utterly unpredictable chain reaction. Everything was about to change, suddenly and radically. Because they were only a few months away from the Reading Festival in August of that year. And I want to recreate what happened at that gig for you, not just with the accounts of the band members, but also with excerpts from a fantastic fan account, taken from the website Slade in England, written by David Graham. If you'd like to read the whole thing, and I highly recommend it, the link is in the description. Noddy Holder says, "I was quite enjoying having some time off and taking it easy when an offer came through to do the Reading Festival. It was the summer of 1980. We'd asked to play Reading 2 years earlier, but the promoters weren't interested. That year, Whitesnake were headlining and Ozzy Osbourne was supposed to be second on the bill. He had left Black Sabbath and was forming his new band, Blizzard of Oz. The trouble was that they weren't ready yet, so Ozzy had pulled out of Reading with only 2 days to go. The organisers asked us to step in at the last minute. They couldn't get anyone else at such short notice. But we had more or less wound Slade down by this point. We'd fulfilled all our contracts for recording and touring, and we had let all our crew go. We hadn't done a proper gig in months."
We hadn't really seen each other for a month or so. We hadn't done anything, recording or anything like that. And then I got a call off Nod, say we'd been offered the Reading Festival. I thought, what? It was Ozzy Osbourne had dropped out, and we were offered his slot. And so we haven't worked together, haven't played together for God knows how long.
That's right, yeah.
And he said, well, what's wrong with that? We can just have a few days rehearsals and go on and do this. I said, okay then.
Dave says, "I got a call from Chas. Listen, Davey, we've got a slot at the Reading Festival." The Reading Festival was a big deal. 3 days over the August bank holiday weekend. But I was so disillusioned with it all, I didn't want to go on. Noddy got on to me next, trying to persuade me, but I wasn't interested. They're all heavy metal bands, and we're from the 70s, they won't like us. UFO were on the bill. Def Leppard were just making a name for themselves. Whitesnake were on, and Budgie. But they chipped away at me. I didn't want to let the others down, so I thought, let's see what we can do. It turned out it was one of those sliding doors moments in life. Chas said, instead of Slade petering out, end on a high at a festival. We had no backstage passes though, and we had to park in the public car park. Whitesnake headlined the festival, but no one knew that we were on, as we weren't even billed. Rumours of their appearance, however, had begun to spread amongst the crowd. David Graham, a hardcore fan, remembers the atmosphere on the ground. I couldn't believe that Slade, our band, were going to be playing at the Reading Rock Festival. It just seemed so left field that it couldn't be true. This was Reading. 80,000 metalheads, bikers, down and dirty heavy metal monsters. Were Slade really going to be coming to town? Slade were, at this time, in the 3rd year of their doldrums. We began to think that to have Slade appear at Reading could be the final nail in their coffin, the pop jesters thrown to the ravening horde, sacrificial lambs. Noddy continues, we unloaded our guitars and walked through the crowd to the backstage, carrying our own cases. Fortunately, we knew all the security guys because most of them had worked for us in the past, so they just let us in. We went on 3rd from the top of the bill. Def Leppard was supposed to be on before us, but they insisted on being moved to above us. David Graham continues, that day as the news that Slade were replacing Ozzy gathered pace, not one person that I spoke to about it had a good word to say about Slade. None seemed to be overtly enamoured that it would be Noddy and not Ozzy. As their allotted time drew closer, the general consensus was that Slade would be the first band of the day to be canned off. Get rid of them as soon as possible and get the real bands on, seemed to be the general feeling. Apart from a handful of people, maybe 200 or so, it seemed that the massed ranks of Harries, bikers, Hells Angels and the unwashed in general had no appetite for Slade. Noddy says Tommy Vance from the Friday Rock Show, who was acting as compere, walked in and predicted we were going to go down a storm. But we weren't so sure. Reading had turned into a metal festival, and that wasn't us. But Tommy was insistent. In 1980, even though a huge name band like Slade were on next, the crowd that was thinly spread out all seemed to turn as one, like a herd of wildebeest, and start heading off back away from the stage towards Tent City. The front of Stage 2 was sparsely populated. Slade, resplendently attired in stripes and yellow, breezed onto the stage. The few hundred people remaining in front of Stage 2 gave a few cheers and shouts of approval as the band plugged in and took their positions. The band recalled, in front of the stage there was a pit for the media. It was empty when we went on. Dave says, I can't deny we were really nervous as we went on stage. I certainly was, but everything just seemed to click. We played 3 songs straight off. We didn't give anyone a chance to say we like you or we hate you. In terms of playing, we were in great nick. We were really good at this point because we'd done all the universities, we were gigging regularly, we were ready. The loudest noise of the weekend blasted out of the Reading sound system. As one, the multitude of people, the herd of heavy metal wildebeest who had dismissed Slade as the day's token jesters, started running back down the hill towards the party that was happening. And I do mean running. Running to get as close as possible to the stage now being occupied by Slade. It was a sight to behold, and by the end of Dizzy Mama, the crowd in front of Stage 2 had swelled from hundreds to 3,000 or 4,000, with thousands more still making their way. Dave says, we played a lot faster than our records. They were a good tempo anyway, but with the years and years of live gigs, we were really at the top of our game, and we knocked the crowd sideways. By now, it was 40,000 people. By the time we finished the 3rd song, we could tell it was okay, and we were flying. Reading was my baptism of fire, rock writer David Ling says. I still remember it as though it was yesterday. The growing realisation of, wow, we are witnessing something special here. As one hit followed another, the mood developed from apathy and borderline ridicule to mild astonishment, and by the halfway mark, euphoria had set in. The crowd continued to swell through When I'm Dancing, I Ain't Fighting, all crammed into the immediate area around the stage and beyond, all jostling. Slade's audience was now the whole festival. 65,000, 75,000, 85,000. Everyone who was there was now watching Slade, and not just watching because that would be painting the wrong picture. They were all joining in. Big, hairy, dirty bastards, multiple tattoos, jumping up and down, stomping, waving their hands. Noddy Holder and his chums had turned an apathetic crowd into a frenzied mass, and the one thing that struck me while watching the crowd was, fuck Ozzy Osbourne, he couldn't do this to a crowd. They came on and blew the place apart. When they did Get Down and Get With It, everyone was stamping on the ground, and it hadn't rained for a few days. It was the biggest dust cloud I've ever seen. It was quite incredible. They just blew the place apart, a real moment. With the party in full swing, Off they went, to an appreciation unheard of. We knew they were coming back to do the one encore that the name bands were allowed. They did, and after a brief run-through of You'll Never Walk Alone, it was straight into a 100-mile-an-hour version of Mama, We're All Crazy Now, and then, once again, they left the Reading stage to a fabulous ovation. But it still wasn't game over. For the first time that weekend, a band returned for a second encore. The crowd demanded it, and so, once again, back they came. The crowd wanted Merry Christmas. We thought we were boring old farts, but the audience went absolutely berserk, Holder said in 2015. The response was tumultuous. They were chanting for Merry Christmas everybody in August. I said, if you want it, you sing it. And they did, so we joined in.
The crowd they were going so crazy, and somebody was shouting down, Merry Christmas. Well, here we were, the middle of summer, heavy metal concert, the whole tens of thousands of people all singing Merry Christmas. Crazy.
The band then launched into a double encore of Come On Feel the Noise and Born to Be Wild. And then it was finally over and the band left the stage. As they waved their goodbyes, Gene Kelly's Singing in the Rain gently wafted from the PA. As an afterthought, Holder took 2 steps back and ordered the crowd to sing along. And, as one, thousands and thousands of voices joined together to sing along, a sea of smiling faces, arms gleefully waving in the air. And, just as the band finally vacated the stage, it actually started to rain. Not a lot, just a few spots of drizzle, before it evaporated away, leaving the huge, swirling entity that the audience had become to ponder what they had just witnessed and been a part of.
And that night driving home, I couldn't sleep, thinking what I'd just done, and I was about to leave.
Back on the main stage, Def Leppard were next. Singer Joe Elliott went on to say, the worst thing of all for us was having to follow Slade. They were great. They put on an amazing show and went down a storm, played the hits. It was a classic case of follow that. We did our best, but it didn't go too well. I got half a tin of tartan lager in my bollocks. Def Leppard tried manfully to follow on, but the adrenaline coursing through the bodies of those watching could not be dampened down, and for a large part of their set, chants of We Want Slade could be heard from small enclaves within the mass. They stole the show and blew all other bands and acts that weekend into oblivion. It was a privilege and a pleasure to have witnessed it firsthand. Until the day I die, I will never forget the sight of all those people turning as one and rushing back to the stage to join in. That crackle in the air as the excitement generated by the band fed the crowd, and the crowd fed the band. And Reading was the regeneration of the band. They came back as a heavy band, and so much more like they were before their pop success. They returned to what they were. Noddy says, Reading was one of those days that marks a complete turning point in your life. It resurrected our career. The next week we were on all the music papers and back on the radio. We were up and running again. Not 3 months earlier, the press had treated them as anthrax carriers. Now they were front page news. After this, Slade released their compilation album Slade Smashes and re-entered the top 40 again at number 21 in the album charts. The album was released in November that year, and by December it had gone gold, selling 200,000 copies. And of course today, Slade are a household name, a much-loved band, as well as a staple of British Christmas radio every year. After Reading, they also finally got their breakthrough hit in America as well in 1983, where My Oh My hit the American charts. If you're interested in hearing Slade's live set at Reading in 1980, they actually released it as an album in 2022. It's available on Spotify, and after listening to it I can see why it appealed so much to the British metalheads. This is Slade playing fast, furious and heavy, and it's absolutely electrifying. Which just goes to show, you can be a band that's that good, you can be a band that has the potential to do that. 1 minute you can be nowhere, and the next you can be on top of the world. But the real moral of this story is self-belief. How many other bands would have thrown in the towel in May of 1980 when they hit rock bottom? The future can happen just like that, unpredictably, with no warning at all. And it just goes to show, you never know what might be just around the very next corner. Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you'd like to see the extended cut of this documentary, you can do so on my Patreon. A massive thank you to all my ongoing supporters on Patreon. Thanks to you as well, and as always, I'll see you next time.